Welcome to Witch Hunt Podcasts. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack.
On today's episode, we're joined by Victoria Canning, professor of criminology at Lancaster University, whose groundbreaking work examines state-defined approaches to torture and what she conceptualizes as torturous violence.
Criminological frameworks will deepen our understanding of witchcraft accusations and persecution.
Professor Canning brings a critical perspective to how societies define, recognize, and respond to severe and repeated abuses.
Her research particularly examines the gendered implications of violence, addressing how conventional definitions often fail to encompass the full spectrum of torturous experiences, including those connected to witchcraft persecutions.
Throughout our conversation, we'll discuss the potential for developing what Victoria calls a criminology of witchcraft, interrogating the social harms perpetuated through accusations and persecution, both historically and in contemporary contexts.
We'll also examine how witchcraft accusations intersect with migration patterns, border policies, and asylum processes, areas that have remained largely unexplored in traditional criminological research.
Join us as we navigate these complex issues and consider how reconceptualizing violence through a critical criminological lens might offer new pathways for addressing witchcraft related persecution and supporting survivors.
Welcome to Witch Hunt Podcast, Victoria Canning. We were so privileged to get to hear you present at the Witchcraft and Human Rights Conference in Lancaster. Please tell our listeners about your work and expertise.
Yes, and it's lovely to see you both again, and it was great to meet you in Lancaster. And what a great and historically important place to be starting these discussions as well. So we can talk a bit more about Lancaster and that role later down the line. I'm a professor of criminology in Lancaster University, and my key areas of expertise are in looking at state-defined approaches to torture, and then what I've kind of defined and conceptualized as torturous violence. So some of those things, severe and often repeated abuses, psychologically and physically, as well as sexually against people, the gendered implications of that as well for women, and how sometimes state definitions and approaches don't always take into consideration what we see in terms of witchcraft persecution, for example, which is in families or communities or by partners or even, and one of my key areas of expertise and interests is borders and migration. So, for example, including with particular social groups and people who are trafficked, and that role of witchcraft persecution and making decisions to move as well. So, a whole plethora of things related to violence, borders, and criminologies really is my interest.
At Lancaster, you gave a talk titled Toward a Criminology of Witchcraft. What would you like the audience to know about the talks that you gave?
I think that witchcraft is something, or witchcraft persecution, as well as social control, is something that has been very largely overlooked by criminology. So criminology being the study of crimes, actually, in some ways, I work a bit against criminology. I work on critical approaches to state forms of persecution from what's called a zemiological perspective. So zemiology is actually the study of social harm. So you can imagine in relation to persecution or witchcraft persecution, those harms can be physical, they can be psychological, they might be cultural, impacting on where people feel safe or can actually physically be. We heard some of this from colleagues who were talking about, for example, albinism and abuses against people with albinism. And Charlotte Baker, who organised the conference, has done a really great job with Miranda Forsyth on talking on some of those. So effectively, what I'd love the audience to take away and what my interest is as well is what can criminology offer the study of witchcraft, persecution and social control? And the more that I've taken time, so my own interests in witchcraft persecution go back till I was very young. Actually, I brought a book with me today that I thought would be of interest. And this was something I got for Christmas when I was 10 years old. So Tales of Witchcraft and Sorcery, this is back from 1994 by Ken Radford. And interestingly, the Lancaster witch trials are in there too. So my own interest was as witchcraft persecution and also the mythologies around witchcraft and folklore as well. Obviously, I come from Ireland. Superstitions are not unusual amongst my family or friends. And bringing those together, though, from a criminological perspective, doesn't seem to be something that has been done in huge depth. So I've long-term interests there. And then, of course, the more I started to look at witchcraft persecution and speak with colleagues around witchcraft persecution, the more gaps there seems to be in thinking about, especially around, for me, migration, why people might migrate, and the role of that in terms of pushing people out of community. And also from torturous violence perspectives, whenever we think about contemporary witchcraft persecution, which is often undertaken by families and communities. And that was something that I also saw, although I didn't really think of it in terms of criminologies of witchcraft, when I used to work with child survivors of sexualized violence in South Africa. So many years ago, 15 or 18 years ago now, where some children had been accused of witchcraft. And that was one of the reasons that they had been removed from the hands of their immediate families. So, I mean, I could talk about where I think criminology, both criminology and zemiology can go from there if that's of interest, because effectively the more that I started reading and some great, like for example, Margaret Malloch is one criminologist who is undertaking some research into witch trials, so histories of witch trials, but up in Scotland. So some of this kind of more contemporary campaigns about remembrance, and the remembrance particularly of women who were persecuted based on witchcraft accusations. But I think there's just so much to offer in relation to state crime studies. So thinking about the roles of state in not intervening historically or contemporarily. Miscarriages of justice is an obvious interest to anybody who's looking at criminology as well. For me, the role of abuse and the plethora of really important, particularly feminist criminology work that goes into challenging cultural abuses that are called cultural. I think it's a lot more complex than that. It's very easy to say cultural abuses actually when we look into many cultures, including in the UK, where I'm based now, we can see that abuses span well beyond what's often represented, which is this idea of kind of persecution in the global south. I think Owen Davies talked a bit about that as well, the kind of that role of colonization and almost neo-colonization into expectations that it's other countries where persecution takes place. And in my experience of working on, I was a trustee for, so that's a director on a board of a rape support service for 6 years or so. Ritualistic abuse was not uncommon in the region that I was working, which is the northwest of England. So many different things seem to draw together where criminology is relevant. And for me, and that is in terms of the state crime element and miscarriages of justice, but also for me, I think the zemiological implications. So those long-term harms on people's lives that can be part of a continuum, and that the psychological impacts of those, which still quite often we don't name. We might name abuse or we might name harm or violence, but very seldom actually name or use terms which are recognized as being particularly abusive, such as torture and torturous violence. So we can really see that in terms of people being, again, historically and contemporarily, targeted either by states or by people around them, and the long-term impacts of those abuses, and how as well we organise support around those abuses, including for when people are seeking asylum if they've fled in relation to witchcraft persecution. Very little is done on this, which is super interesting, but I think that means that there's plenty of places to go in addressing these kinds of harms.
What would be the key benefits of applying criminology to the violence that we're seeing towards people accused of witchcraft?
I think that's a really good question, because criminology is an interesting sort of discipline or subdiscipline. I think the benefits are mutual. One is really focusing, and I think critical criminology in particular, so not really necessarily administrative criminology, but critical criminology, which looks at the role of states in not applying regulations or addressing norms that could reduce harms or abuses. I think that that's where this lie, and feminist criminology in particular, has been at the fore of a lot of that around really difficult topic areas, especially sexualized violence and sexual torture. So there's loads to learn from that. But I also think the other way round. So recently, I run 2 modules at the minute, harms and crimes of the powerful and criminologies of violence. And engaging students in these discussions, that's also where witchcraft persecution can be useful to criminology. So rather than just criminology offering something or a lens, actually learning about, because some key concepts like social control and social othering, all of these things that facilitate and exacerbate persecution are really clear in witchcraft persecution. It's almost one of those sort of, you know, social issues that cover so many aspects of criminology that actually criminology could learn from, I think. And also around thinking about histories of the role of colonization. So we talk about decolonization in universities, actually thinking about the role of witchcraft persecution, etc. In that context as well, I think is really interesting. So I think there's a lot to actually be learned from studies of witchcraft. And also that, I think, opens up to looking at mythologies and folklore, history, all of those subject areas that I think are, or that can often be overlooked in criminology, where sometimes things reinvent the wheel. And if we take a bit of a look into those other subject areas, there's a lot to be garnered and learned from. And certainly that's how I found in looking through and studying. I actually I undertook a course, a university course in histories of witchcraft and the occult a few years ago, which was really interesting on bringing these things together. So there's just so much to be said, I think.
As you're informing us, I'm hearing how much learning and synthesizing there is yet to do, which is exciting. It's not just recognizing these crimes are happening, but understanding why this is happening. And one of the things that I think is a challenge across cultures and communities is definitions, and also through bodies of leadership too. How are we defining different terms? Can you talk to us a little bit about torture and torturous violence and how we should be defining that and applying that?
This is a really good point, and one that is always that where people make distinctions between the role of academia and organizations who are working at the front line of addressing torture and torturous violence or other abuses and human rights abuses as well. And exactly this around definitions is something. So to give an example, recently a really great organization in the UK, Women for Refugee Women, had developed a report on the experiences of women who are in asylum housing and used a concept that I developed on corrosive control. So that kind of the way in which the border controls impact and the gendered implications for women seeking asylum and how that plays into their experiences in often private realms. And that's an example where I think torture and torturous violence is something else that it's about making, in short, it's about making academia useful, putting things into practice, and also to let those heavy lifting kind of discussions that are required for academic publications and stuff that we have to engage in to make them useful. And I think that that is important. And another thing that I kind of work in, and I'm co-editor of a series and co-editor of a book, an international handbook on what's called activist criminology. And that's about using empirically informed evidence to make or engage in active change on social issues that we identify. And witchcraft persecution and that role of the definitions around torturous violence, which is in effect broadens out the narrow scope that is put into the UN Convention Against Torture. So there's loads of conventions that relate to torture and torturous violence, and some that would be applicable to witchcraft persecution as we understand it now, contemporarily. And we're just seeing the aftermath of think more than 100 people were killed recently in Haiti in relation to witchcraft persecution. The kinds of abuses that often go along these things are not always necessarily acknowledged as torture, and yet we can see they have the same impacts as torture, even though they may not be related to extracting information or to gain knowledge, which is often what torture is understood as. Again, even though there's loads of different definitions of torture in international law and in relation to organization working with survivors, it is generally that fairly narrow definition. So in relation to witchcraft persecution, if we open that out to think more about the role of torturous violence, we can see from accounts of people who are subjected to abuses related to witchcraft. These are often sustained. They often becomes impossible to live in a person's own community or the state. Another thing that's both in relation to this and in relation to state harm and crime more generally is that if the state are perpetrators of violence, then where do you go? So my sort of thoughts on torturous violence in this approach is to be able to see those abuses as sustained, as torturous. And I think that the term torture and torturous does have a particular weight to it. When we hear the word torture, I remember having a discussion with someone in the committee against torture, and he had said, whenever we talk about we've got torture, and then we've got cruel and inhumane, and already just by talking about cruel, inhumane, degrading, there was that sort of recognition that without recognizing it, I can see that we still think of this as slightly lesser. And my arguments and my key arguments in the book, Torture and Torturous Violence, is that quite often the impacts through a lifetime, psychologically and physically, are not necessarily lesser than that we would define torture. And certainly I've seen that with women seeking asylum where they have been subjected to what it would be termed false imprisonment, and effectively we would in any other realm call it torture over periods of years. Speaking with somebody recently, they were telling me that that also can relate to witchcraft persecution by putting a threat of accusing witchcraft persecution. So people become afraid to leave. And again, the gendered implications of that. I've met with survivors who've been subjected to being burned and scalded by their husband or partner, multiple perpetrator rape, all forms of abuses that we would consider as torturous if they were under any other circumstances, except for in the home or community. And to me, that really resonates with the key points around witchcraft persecution and what people can be subjected to that sometimes is seen as maybe lesser than what it actually is.
One of the things that you wrote in Torture and Torturous Violence was that torture and torturous violence are everyone's problem. How is that?
That's such a great but multifaceted question. So the way that I've seen that in some of the aspects that I was writing with torture and torturous violence, we tend to put, and a lot of this narrative came through with so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, etc., where these were reframed away from torture as a way to suggest that torture happens elsewhere, but it doesn't happen. It's not the US, it's not the UK who are engaging in torture. And of course, we know that is fundamentally untrue. And we can see that through the various Senate intelligence reports, etc. So we know that's the case. What we don't come to recognize is the implications of those tortures that happen either in countries before migration, and then the long-term impacts on people who are, say, who gain refugee status or who are seeking asylum, who can't access support. In the book, as you can see, some of the documentations of forms of torture and torturous violence that people are recording from people seeking asylum, and some of the oral histories that I undertook with women seeking asylum. These are such severe forms of violence that often have impacts including dissociation, anxiety, trauma, long-term depression, all of these things that if we had a supportive and rehabilitative system to support people who experience these abuses, proper funding, etc., then some of the social issues which then do develop this, it's almost like a ripple effect if people can be so impacted. So in one sense, that one example, the other on torturous violence and why I think that it's everybody's issue is if we take a look, and this is a little bit of a story, but I think I talk about it in the book, but one of the things that's really interesting for me is whenever you take I'll be in trouble for this, but my mom loves to read women's magazines. Thankfully, she hasn't read my book, I don't think, to even get to know that it's in the text. But yeah, she reads things like, I think they're quite specific to the UK, but they're not very expensive. It's just people writing with their stories, and it's predominantly women writing in with stories. And I was in her house a few years ago while I was working on one of the last projects around torture and torturous violence I had been working on. I've just starting a new one now this month actually. Was It was represented as completely exceptional to reality. So the rapist up the stairs, the monster next door, all of these kinds of headings. And when I took a read through these different magazines, I kind of did a bit of a discourse analysis of some of them. These were intensive periods of abuse that would be akin to torture. Some are against, say, fathers or stepfathers against their children, or uncles or brothers or teachers. Things that are actually aspects of what we can see in any sexual abuse inquiries. Unfortunately, not completely unusual or unique experiences. These are part of what Liv Kelly talks about, a continuum of sexual violence in society. So for me, I'm reading these things, I think this is as akin to torture, but not under the states, not with the state as a perpetrator, or a state official as a perpetrator, or on behalf of a state official, not for extracting information, but to inflict violence and abuse. And to me, reading through these just is torturous. And so actually, we have an issue with naming abuses in these ways. And that's why whenever I said that torturous violence, I think there's multi levels to why torturous violence is everybody's issue. One of those is whenever people are tortured and then maybe gain refugee status, or some of the things that people have been subjected to. When I was rereading the book for a presentation I was giving last year, because after I finished the book, I had a period of quite significant burnout, and the impacts of, I've been working in this area for almost 20 years. So the impacts were quite significant without me even seeing that coming. And so the impacts of that, then I almost, when I reread some of the narratives, I could hardly even remember writing them. But yet, of course, I have typed these up. I have listened to these interviews, and what people are subjected to is something that we should be responding to in a humanitarian way, not in the kind of ways that we are contemporarily responding to people seeking asylum, and specifically survivors of torture and torturous violence, which in any other sense, if we could see the kinds of abuses that people are subjected to, and in any other sense, we would recognize that the way of responding should be in a humanitarian way, which is supportive. And I don't like the term rehabilitation, because I don't know what it means to rehabilitate to what, but at least a kind of rehabilitative response over this increased securitized and demonizing response for particularly people seeking asylum, I think, at present.
Yeah. I was thinking about how data collection during the conference that came up a lot, how significant collecting data is, collecting new data. But, as I'm listening to you, I'm realizing there's so much data in these situations that we're maybe not applying to these witchcraft torture situations. And I'm also wondering, so that's one comment or question. Can we use the data we have? How much more data do we need? But then when I'm thinking about this humanitarian response that we need from communities and we need from leadership, is data enough to ignite that? Or what do we do to get the response if we have the data? Because we have the UN resolution asking states to take more action. How do we get that?
I think that this is a really good question, and this probably brings in more of the stuff on kind of activist criminology as well. But I agree. I think this is across the board with research. A new research project, rather than working with what we have and what we know, and taking time to develop and implement changes through through what we have already, the knowledge we've already amassed. Sometimes I think if we put as much work into making the changes as we do in collecting more and making things bigger, we could really harbor and gain some shifts. I think implementing terms that bring people's attention to this. I've been researching, for example, I've been researching on asylum for more than 15 years in the UK, and yet I haven't seen much in the way at all, even of the organizations people in organizations I've interviewed, barristers or lawyers or social workers or psychologists or psychotraumatologists. Very seldom do I hear about, if at all actually, much on witchcraft persecution. And yet we know that there must be information about witchcraft persecution in relation to asylum or people are coming across stuff. How we name it, and this is what has been one of the key things that I've been arguing in torture and torturous violence, how we go about naming it so it's part of that discussion and conversation in more than one realm. So often things are separated out, like you've got witchcraft persecution here, you've got asylum here. That's why I think border criminologies of witchcraft persecution and social control brings these things together to tie up, to bring these variable perspectives into focus. And again, one of the things that I think is important and can be accessible is what's called, and I think Charlotte Baker has worked under this, impact grants for impact. So for developing toolkits alongside colleagues who were at the fore. I'm really keen. So the project that I'm working on now is called Torture in Transit. And that's about building support techniques and toolkits for survivors so that we can bring those together. So for example, if you're a psychotraumatologist working with survivors of torture, but you have no knowledge of witchcraft persecution in a particular country of origin, and someone is saying that they've been subject for cultural reasons or religious reasons or whatever terms might be used, we don't always flag those things. And similarly, things are named, even for example, sexual violence. So this is another kind of key point in torture and torturous violence, is people will describe sexual abuse in very vague ways, or torture in very vague ways. So it's not always easy to interpret or have a flag that says, I think this person is possibly, so I'm going to ask this question further to find out if this has been torture or domestic torturous violence or sexualized abuse. And build that kind of language to open up those discussions that knit these different things together. So that's, I think, one thing that's really key and really useful about academia is bringing those perspectives together to build toolkits that can be implemented. And one of the other things that just came to my mind there when you asked that is, and I think that this is important for all people who are working in research is finding out if you're going along the right lines. So two really important learning curves of my life, I would say, has been, I remember when I was doing my PhD, which was 15, 16 years ago now, and I wanted to find out about the impacts of conflict-related violence on women seeking asylum. And that, of course, is the core of the subject area. But what I was finding with women seeking asylum was where I wanted to use the work that I was doing in sexual violence support to support and fill gaps with survivors. Actually, so many survivors were impacted by borders. So not knowing where you were going to be staying that night, issues of being dispersed at last minute, not having the money to even go to support organizations to get the bus to get there. All of these things that actually get in the way, learning from that and thinking, actually, I need to take this in a different direction because this is my priority, but it's actually not there. It's not the people that I'm working with priority. And the other is going back. Whenever I finished or before I finished torture and torturous violence, I was developing concepts of silencing and 10 mechanisms for silencing of sexual violence, particularly, or sexual torture, particularly, and different perspectives on torture. And rather than just come up with the ideas and write a book, I went back over and over again to different audiences and different groups, to lawyers, practitioners, and presented my ideas and got hammered for some of them. And then, but that was about iteration. Likewise, speaking with people seeking asylum and building another toolkit that myself and colleagues at Right to Remain had been developing, is speaking to people about what works for you rather than I know what's best, so I'm just going to crack on with my ideas. That's an important learning curve that would save everybody and a lot of work, I think. But yeah, I think it's about hearing that from the ground up and from survivors and organizations themselves.
I want to touch on the gendered aspects of torture and torturous violence. We know that there's definitely a gendered aspect to witchcraft persecutions. It's predominantly been something used against women and girls historically. Is there a similar gendered aspect to torture?
Yeah, I think that was the key instigator for the text, actually, and for rethinking the definitions that are used in practice. Predominantly, torture, as we would define it in the UN Convention Against Torture, i.e., by or at the behest of state officials, usually in forms of confinement. So if we think about confinement, who is predominantly confined? It is mostly men. And it's that interesting because when we think of gender perspectives, we often overlook that men are, in the definition of the UN Convention, predominantly those who are tortured, because they are predominantly those who are targeted for being in political positions, or who are in confinement, and subsequently there's more access to being tortured in confinement under the definition. On the other side, what we acknowledge, and I still don't think, I certainly don't think that torture is anywhere near acknowledged as much as it should be, or the torture of men or men seeking asylum. But on the side of that is that kind of long-term silencing of domestic and interpersonal abuses, and the extra layers of silencing that particularly sexualized violence, including sexualized torture against men, how the layers of these impact on what we can come to know and address. So yeah, the gendered implications of what I was finding with some organizations, for example, who are working with survivors of torture, is that most of the people that they were supporting were men. And that makes sense if we use the Convention Against Torture. What doesn't make sense is that if we only use that definition, or if that definition becomes the dominant definition, then quite often the same forms of abuses, but all undertaken by violent partners, or in relation to witchcraft persecution, for example, we can see community members, etc. Even if you look through the recent reports into things like abuse in the Magdalen laundries and stuff in Ireland, these are clearly torturous and clearly gendered. So my kind of key point is to take that long-term, how do we address such silenced issues around sexualized violence and sexualized torture and sexualized torturous violence, which is often in relationships where people, predominantly women, are subjected to repeat or continued sexualized abuse over periods of time. And I've met women seeking asylum where this has been over years of time, or as part of a continuum where during the migratory process, different points at which women were subjected to different forms of violence, again, from all different kinds of actors, all different kinds of people. So border guards or police or people in refugee camps, or also with smugglers. Like you can come across, and if you read around border criminologies, you can come across that this is a kind of continuum of persecution. So that, a bit like witchcraft persecution, that opens up to thinking about the roles of how to address the abuses that are in existence, and how to challenge the silence that is so deeply enshrouded around these kinds of particular abuses. And of course, stigma is one of those one of the kind of key aspects of silencing, and how we go about addressing that is what I'm hopefully working toward with this contemporary project with the Danish Institute Against Torture.
Yeah, stigmatization, that is such a challenge because you'll have individuals or individual organizations speaking out. Maybe in some areas, there's victims that are able to do that. But it reminds me of kind of my question earlier where I said, well, we have the data. How do we get that humanitarian response? How do we get the family and the community and the support organizations to hear this stigma is keeping us from taking action. Let's dismantle that. How do you get there?
I think that in the, again, there's so many different ways, and they always have to be taken into consideration what is appropriate for the space that you're in, the place that you're in. Often these one key issue, and it really is a key issue, is also funding. So you're often in really inappropriate areas to talk about, like personal experiences or sexualized violence. Same whenever it comes to assessing claims for refugee status. Who wants to walk into a room with somebody that they don't know and start talking about sexualized violence? And that stigma runs really deep. I had a few years ago, I was teaching some undergraduate students, and I remember one of my students saying, "You'd rather be dead than like survive rape." And I was so, I mean, it's hard for me to be taken aback on anything, but it was this kind of assumption that that survival isn't something that can ever be. I mean, survival is always a process. But supporting people through survival is the key to that process. Key to being able to never to necessarily get over subjections of abuse, but to live with what we have. Liz Kelly speaks about this very well some years ago in a seminar that I organized, where she said it's like a backpack that you put on. Sometimes there's bricks in it. Sometimes it's heavier. Sometimes you can take those bricks out, but the backpack's always there. And I really think that if we start to recognize that survivors are not all defined by histories of violence, we are multifaceted humans. And subsequently, get into that I do think is the class, for example, just didn't bat an eyelid. So I was so shocked that this was, and of course it's because quite often this is the first forum that even at that age, at 20, 21, or whatever age my students were, I usually teach second or third year, so yeah, 20, 21, are really talking about sexualized abuse, violence, torture in any sort of depth, and hearing it as something that is both part of society and something that can be challenged through really focusing on perpetration apart from anything else and the perceptions that lead to perpetration. And that goes for witchcraft persecution also, but also in this dismantling of stigma. And it's interesting because I'm not sure if you've been following the Giselle Pericot case in France, and that stigma, shame must change sides. And I just think this is such a powerful phrase in relation to stigma, of the recognition that the shame, the problems of the social problems, that the stigma lies in the perpetration of sexual violence, not in the being subjected to or surviving. And I wonder if the role of Giselle Pericot's approach will shift that narrative. There's always a danger there, I would also say, though, because then it becomes as if all survivors can always be strong or always be able to face stigma. And actually, survival, the most important thing is that survival is a process. It should never be an expectation that you're just going to be able to get up today, or it's also okay to have days where that's not okay. But in all, being able to bring these in, and it's difficult to do, working with students, working with the public or anything. I've even found with working sometimes with practitioners who will talk about all kinds of violence or abuse. But once it comes to sexualized violence, then this becomes something that people can struggle with, or as one practitioner said to me once, you're really opening a can of worms if you want to talk about that. And of course we are, but but the can is there whether we open it or not. And to get to challenging stigma And again, I'm talking about this from my research on sexualized violence and torture, but I think this also goes with some of the strengths of addressing witchcraft persecution as being the problem of perpetration and that kind of platform for survivors to safely be supported into their their narratives, challenging that stigma around those narratives. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's definitely stigma involved with the witchcraft persecutions as well. Against the survivors, there's always the risk that they'll be reaccused or, you know, someone will perpetrate something against them again because they've got this reputation that they did nothing to bring upon themselves, but that stigma is still there. And how do we help provide them with an environment where they can even come out and feel safe acknowledging that this happened to them?
And I think that's a very real fear for survivors to have. That's another thing. It's easy enough to be distant to the subject or not be the person who is at risk of imminent persecution. This is similar for other forms of state crime and violence, of domestic and interpersonal abuses or familial abuses. The risk is real and the risk is there. And again, I think for a long time, how we move towards shifting toward perpetration and challenging myths. Again, just drawing in Charlotte Baker's work on challenging albinism, those kinds of even just general facts. We had it whenever I was working with. It wasn't so much. It wasn't around witchcraft persecution, but it was a form of mythologies of magic, where some of the children that we were supporting were raped as part of a belief that having sex with virgins would transfer HIV, so that you would be free of HIV, and that this was kind of a personal cure. So, developing responses that are, and again, I come from a critical criminological perspective here, that address the harm increasing without increasing the kind of punitive, as if punitive approaches are the only way. So there was always quite difficult, and it's always quite difficult working on forms of abuse when if the approach is only punitive, and sometimes that's out of your hands whenever it comes to, say, criminal justice approaches, etc. But certainly working with challenging mythologies, challenging drawing together facts, focusing on knowledge and information. Otherwise, I work in higher education. What's the point in higher education if we can't use education to challenge myths and to focus? And rather than, I think it's just that balance, isn't it, between what the criminal justice approach takes and what working through myth busting and challenging sometimes really quite problematic beliefs, whether they're, and they can also be religious beliefs. We talk about this as if it's contemporarily only happens in sort of certain areas of the world. But again, the same kinds of abuses we can see in inquiries into child sex abuse in the UK. I've already mentioned the Magdalene laundries, the kinds of torture and torturous violence that have been embedded in these institutions. So using that sort of the strength of education to reframe and drawing in things that, as we said, you mentioned earlier, Sarah, but looking at definitions and how definitions can sometimes be limiting. And what if they are limiting, if they're not helping, what can we do to shift that forward? And then, and certainly loads of people will disagree with me on my work on torturous violence. That's fine. But where concepts are useful, then let's get them out there and apply. That's another thing that's, again, difficult. I was mentioning earlier about that funding. We are in such increasing disparity of wealth in this kind of contemporary form of capitalism. To see that you can go take a trip around on a space, to be able to afford these things whilst people can't afford to travel, to migrate from conflict or from torture. And then the way in which organizations, like just the disparity in where finances go, it is, I think this is almost my very words, but it does, as you can tell, really get to me. But it is such a disgrace of our times that organizations which are working with survivors of violence are often so poorly funded, whilst other corporate benefits, etc., in existence that cost so much more. So for me, that a whole rejigging of the landscape of how we go about challenging violence in the first place, challenging stigma that comes from violence, and facilitating like holistic support, all around support for people in the aftermath of violence, I think it's particularly important. And I kind of say that because, you know, that is funded, it has enough funding to support survivors. It just shouldn't be the case in contemporary society. So that I think that is one of the things that really impacts on being able to develop educational programs or myth busting programs, and also rehabilitative support. So many of the people, not just in the book Torture and Torturous Violence, some of the other texts that I've written, gendered harm and structural violence in the British asylum system being one. I mean, what people who are working at the fore are expected to do in an everyday scenario of basically not, you may be going into a job to be doing one kind of job, like working in psychology with survivors. Actually, what you end up doing is a million other things. And that is, again, down to often people having to show KPIs or get funding bids in because that landscape is just so poor. And in this contemporary era of continuously demonizing people seeking asylum, it just seems to get lesser and lesser. And these are things that also require myth busting out. That's why I think higher education is of relevance where it is. If we can get that out, and things like what you guys are doing with accessible podcasts and all of the other means that we can do stuff, this is, to me, the most important aspects of how we go about challenging stigma in these ways. I could waffle on about that forever because it really gets fine. But yeah.
I just want to ask you if there's anything else you wanted to say.
I think the only thing to say is it will be really interesting to see where criminology of witchcraft, persecution, and social control can go, and what
Yeah.
these sorts of histories can learn from each other, like the variable disciplines and how these kind of knowledge move into practice. And yeah, and of course, it was great to meet you both in Lancaster, and I really appreciate the invitation into today's show. It's been fab to hear your questions and get me thinking about where some things could be useful or where they can go. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And now Sarah has End Witch Hunts news.
Today for End Witch Hunts News, I'm going to talk about Podcast-thon, a global movement for change. Podcast-thon is the world's largest podcast charity initiative, launched in 2023. What began with 300 French-speaking podcasters has expanded to over 400 participants in 2024 and is now going global. The movement's vision is clear: to build up podcasting for good from a mere catchphrase into a worldwide effort that unites thousands of podcasters across dozens of languages annually. Co-founders Jeremy Mani and Yves Stelnat created Podcast-thon as an innovative alternative to traditional fundraising methods like charity galas and marathons, which often face limitations in budget, accessibility, and sustained engagement. Thank you, Jeremy and Yves. End Witch Hunts is excited to join this movement. We're proud to announce that we are going to participate by releasing a special series titled Ending Witch Hunts, featuring daily episodes from March 15th through March 21st. These special episodes will in part highlight our podcast GoFundMe campaign, which aims to fund our travel to the Magic and Witchcraft Conference in June 2025. This important conference themed What is a Witch provides crucial expert content for our educational efforts. Our attendance at last year's conference allowed us to bring fresh perspectives and expert guests to our podcast. Your support will help cover travel costs, ensuring we can continue to deliver high-quality, authoritative content on this important topic. Join us in supporting this innovative approach to charitable giving and education through the power of collaborative podcasting. What will you learn from our Podcast-thon 2025 special release series? For 1 week, we'll take listeners across multiple continents as we explore witchcraft accusations, a worldwide human rights issue. Each day, we'll release a special episode. March 15th, we'll consider Boris Gershman's research on witchcraft belief and discuss our nonprofit's journey. March 16th, we'll talk about Africa's battle against witch hunts, highlighting advocates from South Africa, Nigeria, Malawi, and more. On March 17th, you'll hear about sorcery accusation-related violence in Papua New Guinea. March 18th, we'll spotlight Asia's anti-witchcraft accusation movement. On March 19th, you'll hear from guest Holly Bamford on historic witch trials in England, and we'll share highlights from the global conference that we met Holly at, the Magic and Witchcraft Conference 2024. March 20th is the European Initiatives in Modern-Day Accusations, and we'll finish it off on the 21st with U.S. witch trials, exonerations, and contemporary challenges. Join us for this powerful theme that spans continents but shares one goal: ending witch hunts worldwide. Throughout the series, we'll amplify the vital work and messages of allied organizations fighting on the front lines of this human rights issue. Join us in supporting this innovative approach to charitable giving and education through the power of collaborative podcasting. Please consider backing our GoFundMe campaign to help fund our vital work and explore ways to support the frontline organizations we'll spotlight throughout our series. Together, we can amplify these voices and make a meaningful difference in ending witch hunts globally.
Thank you, Sarah.
You're welcome.
And thank you for joining us on Witch Hunt.
You should check out our robust catalog of expert discussions.
Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.